Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Len. Good afternoon, and welcome to our fifth public event of the Gender Research Institute series, The Times of Crisis Lectures. I'm Annabelle Martin, the director of the Gender Research Institute and a faculty member here in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and Women's and Gender Studies. We began our journey 4 weeks ago on April 10th, going on 5 now. And we started with a panel of alums that are social activists, and with the visit of the distinguished Dennis Goldberg, who the historical member of the ANC was here visiting us on our first. They kicked off the inaugural event. Our second event brought together the minds of John Berger and Noam Chomsky. And last Friday, we had with us renowned journalist and social activist and independent media woman, Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! This past Tuesday, we saw the photographs of internationally acclaimed photojournalist, war photographer James Nachtwey. And today, we have with us feminist philosopher and social and critical theorist Nancy Fraser, a scholar who has deeply mapped out the ways feminism and critiques of capitalism and neoliberalism need not stray apart from each other if we are to understand the crises of our times. We could not be happier, Nancy, to have you here with us, and want to thank you for the time you spent with us at lunch and for your thoughtfulness and your care in answering our questions. We have 2 more events in the series, the next one being on Monday with the visit of Jennifer Klugman, who is the Director of Gender and Development at the World Bank. And I'm pretty sure that Professor Fraser's talk will help set up a very productive framework paradigm for thinking about Monday's talk. And next Friday, we have our closing event with the visit of Angela Davis. So she'll be here next Friday. So anyone who is still not on our mailing list would like to be, just send us an email, okay, at grid@dartmouth.edu, and we'll very happily put you on that list. For those of you who are coming here for the first time, I'm very briefly going to try to explain to you what the GRID seminar entails. It's a 3-legged approach to teaching, research, and social engagement. Each spring, we organize a series of events around a topic of pressing interest. And each spring, we have around that topic three important things. One is a class. So students are enrolled in a Women's and Gender Studies course called Times of Crisis. There are 28 GRID fellows, faculty, students, and staff, graduate students, undergraduate students, staff, and faculty that participate in the GRID seminar. And then we have the community event, which is the public lecture also of Times of Crisis. And this is our way of bringing together GRID's mission of trying to link together scholarship, teaching, and social activism. No introduction is an introduction without thanking someone. So I do want to thank all the people that work behind the scenes, our media and technical support colleagues, our GRID office manager, Nancy O'Brien, who without her, nothing would happen. Intern Stephanie Chavez-Yenter, Jennifer Gargano, and Tanita Zubi, who also keep the trains running. And funding for all of these events, our lunches, our dinners, faculty visits, et cetera, come from presidential funds that were given to us by the former President Carol Folt, and current institutional support from the Dean of the Faculty Office and the Provost Office. The person who's going to introduce Professor Fraser to us is Professor Amy Allen. She is Dartmouth's Parents Distinguished Research Professor in the Humanities. Amy is a professor of philosophy and of women's and gender studies, and she is widely published on the topics of power, subjectivity, agency, autonomy in the works of Foucault, Habermas, Butler, and Arendt. She's the author of 2 books, with a third just accepted, and is a leading international figure on the intersections of feminist thought and critical theory. Amy is also a very cherished colleague. An original member of the GRID development team. She's a current member of the GRID steering committee. She's also a GRID fellow in this year's Times of Crisis seminar. I relentlessly rely on Amy's wisdom and sharp critical eye in the advancement of GRID. Anyone who's worked with Professor Allen on any Dartmouth committee knows of her commitment, her seriousness, and her work ethic, and her drive to make the team advance. And Amy does this with her signature modesty and dignity. and I thank her for that too. So, onward with these lessons in democracy, our Times of Crisis series. Thank you.
Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Nancy Fraser. Professor Fraser is the Henry and Louise Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research. An internationally renowned feminist critical theorist, Nancy Fraser has written or co-written 9 books and dozens of articles. She's a theorist with a truly global impact and audience, whose work has been translated into a stunning array of languages, including, and I'm not sure if I got all of them, so I apologize if not, but Swedish, German, Turkish, Czech, Polish, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. She has held distinguished appointments, visiting professorships, and fellowships all around the world, including at Cambridge University, the University of Amsterdam, the University of Frankfurt, the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and the University of Paris, Wheat. A master of the essay form, Fraser's work is characterized by an uncanny ability to survey an entire discursive field, distill it into its essential elements, diagnose its blind spots, and construct new, better, more productive analytical frameworks for thinking through social and political issues. And all of that often within the confines of a single essay. And I've actually seen the talk she's going to give today before, and you'll see what I mean, I think, when she's done. Fraser made a name for herself in the 1980s with a series of incisively critical essays on some of the foremost social and political thinkers of the time, Michel Foucault, Richard Rorty, Jürgen Habermas, and Jacques Derrida. These essays were collected into her first groundbreaking book, Unruly Practices, which appeared in 1989. 1 year later, she participated in an important and ultimately field-changing symposium as part of the Greater Philadelphia Philosophy Consortium on Feminism and Postmodernism, together with Judith Butler and Shayla Ben-Habib. Their now classic exchange was later published as the book Feminist Contentions, A Philosophical Exchange. In both of these early books, Fraser staked out a distinctive and original philosophical position based on a critical appropriation of insights from both French post-structuralism and the German Frankfurt School critical theory tradition, with some Rorty-style pragmatism thrown in, always developed and deployed with an eye toward the needs and aims of on-the-ground feminist political struggles. In the 1990s, Fraser turned her critical attention to the then newly emerging paradigm of recognition theory and its convergence with the ascendancy of debates over identity and identity politics. Arguing against the grain of much feminist theory at the time, Fraser contended that what she calls the cultural turn in feminism had gone too far. And she made a powerful case that if we wanted to truly understand the post-socialist condition, feminists and critical theorists needed to broaden our framework for thinking about justice, such that that framework could encompass both recognition and redistribution. This case was forcefully articulated in her 1997 book, Justice Interruptus, and in the 2003 book, Redistribution or Recognition, A Political Philosophical Exchange, that she co-authored with Axel Honneth. More recently, Fraser has expanded her framework for thinking about justice, which now encompasses not only recognition and redistribution, but also issues of political representation, particularly thought through the context of globalization and transnational struggles over the proper framing of political issues. This work culminated in her 2009 book, Scales of Justice. She has also deepened her critique of the cultural turn in feminist theory, arguing that not only did this turn divert our attention from important issues of economic redistribution, it also happened at precisely the historical moment when the current neoliberal form of global capitalism was emerging. Hence, through a kind of cunning of history worthy of Hegel himself, Fraser argues that feminists and other critical theorists took our eyes off the economic ball at the worst possible moment. As a result, not only have we failed to produce the kind of critique of neoliberal capitalism that we desperately need, we have also failed to see the ways in which feminism itself has been co-opted and represented by capitalist structures. And this thesis has been powerfully articulated in her most recent book, Fortunes of Feminism. In her current work, Nancy Fraser is turning her formidable critical and analytical powers to constructing a critical theory of neoliberal capitalism, drawing creatively and productively on the work of Karl Polanyi and Karl Marx. It is an honor to have Nancy Fraser here at Dartmouth today to share some of this recent work with us. The title of her talk is Behind Marx's Hidden Abode: For a Gender-Sensitive Conception of Capitalism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nancy Fraser.
Thank you very, very much, first of all, Amy, for that very, very generous and thoughtful introduction. And thanks so much to Annabelle Martine for inviting me and hosting me here, and to Nancy O'Brien for her tip-top organizational and logistical work. It's a real pleasure, although I have to say I'm a bit humbled after hearing who the other visitors in this series were. I'm not sure that I can possibly live up to this level, but I'll give it my best. Well, as Professor Allen just mentioned, I do think it's time to think seriously again about capitalism, and there is no better place to start even now than Karl Marx. We are living, in my view, and probably in yours as well, through a crisis of very great severity and complexity. It is at bottom, I believe, a crisis of capitalism. Yet, today's crisis does not fit the standard models of capitalist crisis that we have inherited. Clearly, today's crisis is multidimensional, encompassing not only the official economy, including finance, but also such apparently non-economic phenomena as global warming, what we are calling care deficits and other disturbances of social reproduction, as well as the hollowing out of public power at every scale. Yet our received models of crisis tend to focus exclusively on the economic aspect, which they isolate from and privilege over the other factors. Equally important, today's crisis is generating novel political configurations and grammars of social conflict. Struggles over nature, social reproduction, and public power are central to this constellation, implicating multiple axes of inequality, including nationality, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, class, and gender. In this respect, too, however, our received theoretical models fail us as they continue, by and large, to privilege struggles over labor and over production. In general, then, we lack conceptions of capitalism and of capitalist crisis that are adequate to our time. My objective in this lecture is to suggest a path that could begin to remedy that lacuna. It's a path that leads through the thought of Karl Marx, whose understanding of capitalism I propose to resituate in a broader frame. Marx's thought has much to offer in the way of general conceptual resources, and it is in principle open to the larger concerns I've just mentioned. Yet, it must be admitted, it fails to reckon systematically with ecology, social reproduction, and political power as fundamental structuring principles and orders of domination in capitalist society, let alone as stakes and premises of social struggle. So Marx's best insights need to be reconstructed in a broader perspective, I think. In the present lecture, I'm going to try to do just that. My strategy is to look first at Marx and then behind him, in hopes of shedding some new light on some very old questions. What exactly is capitalism? How is it best conceptualized? Should we think of it as an economic system, as a form of ethical life, or as an institutionalized social order? How should we characterize its crisis tendencies, and where should we locate them? Okay, well, to address these questions, I'm going to begin in my first step by recalling in a very brief schematic way 4 features that Marx took to be definitive of capitalism. And so my approach is going to sound at first sight to be very orthodox. However, I intend to de-orthodoxize it very shortly by showing how these 4 core features presuppose some other things which constitute their background conditions of possibility. Just as Marx looked behind the sphere of exchange into what he called the hidden abode of production in order to discover capitalism's secrets, so I'm going to seek production's conditions of possibility behind that sphere in realms that are more hidden still. Now, for Marx, the first defining feature of capitalism, this is going to be Marx 101. It will be familiar to many of you, or a quick crash course for the rest of you. Marx's first defining feature is private property in the means of production, which presupposes a class division between the owners and the producers. This division arises as the result of the breakup of a previous social world in which most people, however differently situated, had access to the means of subsistence and the means of production without having to go through labor markets. Capitalism decisively overturned such arrangements. It enclosed the commons, abrogated the majority's customary use rights, and transformed shared resources into the private property of a small minority. As a result, those who produce society's wealth must now sell their labor power as a commodity on the market. Only in this way, by exchanging their capacity to work for cash wages, can they get access to work and to the goods they need to continue living and raising their families. Here, then, is a second defining feature of capitalism, according to Marx, the free market in labor power, that peculiar commodity which, when used in production, can generate value in excess of its own costs of reproduction. Now, this brings us directly to Marx's third core feature of capitalism, which concerns the strange phenomenon of what he called self-expanding value. Capitalism is peculiar, he maintains, in having an objective systemic thrust or directionality, namely the accumulation of capital, which constrains the owners as well as the producers. In this system, everyone's efforts to satisfy their needs are necessarily indirect, harnessed to something else that assumes priority, and that is an overriding imperative inscribed in an impersonal system, capital's own drive to unending expansion. Marx is absolutely brilliant on this point, in my view. In a capitalist society, he says, capital itself becomes the subject. Human beings are its pawns, reduced to figuring out how they can get what they need in the interstices by feeding the beast. Now, the fourth feature, according to Marx, specifies the distinctive role of markets in capitalist society, and it requires a slightly more extended discussion. Markets have existed throughout human history, including in non-capitalist societies, so we need to figure out what is specific to them in capitalism. Their functioning under capitalism is distinguished by 2 further characteristics in Marx's view. First, markets serve in capitalist society to allocate all the major inputs to commodity production, not just labor, but also capital goods, raw material, machinery, energy, credit, real estate. Allocating these productive inputs through market mechanisms, capitalism transforms them into commodities. And so it is, in Piero Sraffa's arresting phrase, a system for the production of commodities by means of commodities. I think you could not ask for a better definition. Although, as we shall see very shortly, it's a system that also relies on a background of non-commodities. Now, markets also assume a second key function in a capitalist society. They determine how society's surplus will be invested. How a society uses its surplus capacities is absolutely central, raising fundamental questions about how people want to live, where they choose to invest their collective energies, how they propose to balance productive work vis-a-vis family life, as we would say today, leisure and other activities, how they aspire to relate to non-human nature, what they aim to leave to future generations. Capitalist societies effectively leave such decisions to the owners who privately appropriate the social surplus and invest it according to market criteria with the aim of maximizing accumulation. This is perhaps the most consequential and perverse characteristic of capitalist societies, in my view, and of course it's closely related to that third core feature, capital's inherent but blind directionality, the self-expansionary process through which it constitutes itself as the subject of history, displacing the human beings who have made it and turning them into its servants. Now, by stressing these two roles of markets, I am signaling my dissent from the early Frankfurt School view that capitalism propels the ever-increasing commodification of life as such. I want to stress instead Emanuel Wallerstein's point that capitalism has generally operated on the basis of what he calls semi-proletarianized households. Under these arrangements, which allow owners to pay workers less, many households derive a significant portion of their sustenance from sources other than cash wages, including self-provisioning, for example, the garden plot, the sewing machine, informal reciprocity, that is mutual aid and in-kind transactions, and state transfers, welfare benefits, social services, public goods. Such arrangements leave a significant portion of activities and goods outside the purview of the market. They are not mere residual holdovers from pre-capitalist times, nor are they on their way out. They were intrinsic to Fordism, which was able to promote working-class consumerism in the countries of the core only by way of semi-proletarianized households that combined male employment with female homemaking, as well as, of course, by inhibiting commodity production in the periphery. Semi-proletarianization is even more pronounced in the financialized capitalism of the present era, which has built an entire accumulation strategy by expelling billions of people from the official economy into informal gray zones from which capital siphons off value, in part through debt. As we shall see, this sort of primitive accumulation, as it's been called, is an ongoing process from which capital profits and on which it relies. So my point here is that marketized aspects of capitalist society coexist with non-marketized aspects. This is no fluke or empirical contingency, in my view, but a feature built into capitalism's DNA. In fact, coexistence is too weak a term to capture the relation between the marketized and non-marketized aspects of a capitalist society. A better term might be functional imbrication, or better still, and certainly more simply, dependence. Markets depend for their very existence on non-marketized social relations which supply their background conditions of possibility. And that's the point I want to elaborate now as I move to the second step of my argument. So far, I've been elaborating a fairly orthodox definition of capitalism based on four core features that seem to be economic. I've effectively followed Marx in looking behind the common sense perspective, which focuses on market exchange, to the so-called hidden abode of production. Now, however, I want to look behind that hidden abode to see what is more hidden still. My claim is that Marx's account of capitalist production only makes sense when we start to fill in its background conditions of possibility. And so my next question will be, what must exist behind these core features in order for them to be possible? Now, I have to note right off the bat that Marx himself broaches a question of this very sort near the end of Volume 1 of Das Kapital, in the chapter on so-called primitive or original accumulation. Where did capital come from, he asks. How did private property and the means of production come to exist, and how did the producers become separated from those means of production? In the preceding chapters, Marx had already laid bare capitalism's economic logic in abstraction from its background conditions of possibility, which were assumed as simply given and taken for granted. But it turned out there was a whole backstory about where capitalism itself comes from, where capital itself comes from. A rather violent story of dispossession and expropriation. Moreover, as David Harvey has famously stressed, this backstory is not located only in the past at the beginnings of capitalism. Expropriation is rather an ongoing, albeit unofficial, mechanism of accumulation, which continues alongside the official mechanism of exploitation, which is Marx's front story, so to speak. This move from the front story of exploitation to the back story of expropriation constitutes a major epistemic shift, which casts everything that went before in a different light. Just as Marx's earlier move, near the beginning of Volume 1, from the perspective of market exchange to the hidden abode of production, revealed the dirty secret that accumulation proceeds via exploitation and not via the exchange of equivalents, so this move from exploitation to expropriation at the volume's end discloses an even dirtier secret. Behind the sublimated coercion of wage labor lies overt violence and outright theft. By directing our gaze to what is hidden behind the hidden abode, it discloses that expropriation is a background condition of possibility for exploitation. Arguably, however, there are at least three more equally momentous epistemic shifts that are implied in Marx's account of capitalism, but not developed by him. These moves to abodes that are even more hidden are still in need of conceptualization. They need to be written up in new volumes of Capital, if you like, if we are to develop an adequate understanding of 21st century capitalism. The first is the epistemic shift from economic production to social reproduction, to the forms of provisioning, caregiving, and interaction that produce and maintain social bonds. Variously called care, affective labor, or subjectivation, this activity forms capitalism's human subjects, sustaining them as embodied natural beings, while also constituting them as social beings, forming their habitus and the socio-ethical substance or Sittlichkeit in which they move. Central here is the work of socializing the young, building communities, producing and reproducing the shared meanings, affective dispositions, and horizons of value that underpin social cooperation. In capitalist societies, much, though not all, of this activity goes on outside the market, in households, neighborhoods, and a host of public institutions, including schools, among others. And much of it, though not all, does not take the form of wage labor. Yet, social reproductive activity is absolutely necessary to the existence of waged work, to the accumulation of surplus value, and to the functioning of capitalism as such. It is, like original accumulation, an indispensable background condition for the possibility of capitalist production. Structurally, moreover, the division between social reproduction and commodity production is central to capitalism, indeed, is an artifact of it. As scores of feminist theorists have stressed, the distinction is deeply gendered and has underpinned modern capitalist forms of women's subordination. Like that between owners and workers, this division, too, rests on the breakup of a previous world. In this case, what was shattered was a world in which women's work, although distinguished from men's, was nevertheless visible and publicly acknowledged, an integral part of the social universe. With capitalism, by contrast, reproductive labor is split off, relegated to a separate private domestic sphere where its social importance is obscured. And in this new world, where money is a primary medium of power, the fact of its being unpaid seals the matter. Those who do this work are structurally subordinate to those who earn cash wages, even as their work also supplies necessary preconditions for wage labor. Far from being universal, then, the division between production and reproduction arose historically with capitalism, but it was not simply given once and for all. On the contrary, the division has mutated historically, taken different forms in different phases of capitalist development. During the 20th century, some aspects of social reproduction were transformed into public services and public goods, deprivatized but not commodified. Today, the division is mutating again as financialized capitalism reprivatizes some of these services, devolving them back onto households and communities, in some cases, turning them into commodities in other cases, while also commodifying additional aspects of social reproduction for the first time. In this way, the capitalism of our time is redrawing the institutional boundaries that separate commodity production from social reproduction, and so is reconfiguring the gender order. By demanding retrenchment of public provision at the same time that it is massively recruiting women into low-waged service and manufacturing work, this capitalism is mounting a fierce assault on social reproduction as such, and thereby turning this background condition for capital accumulation into a major flashpoint of capitalist crisis. Now, there's also a second, equally momentous shift in epistemic perspective, which directs us to another hidden abode. This shift is best embodied in the work of eco-socialist thinkers who are now writing another backstory about capitalism's free riding on nature. This story concerns capital's annexation, its Landnahme, as Rosa Luxemburg would say, of nature, both as a source of inputs to production and as a sink to absorb the latter's waste. Nature here is made into a resource for capital, one whose value is both presupposed and disavowed. Treated as costless in capital's account, nature is expropriated without compensation or replenishment, and in effect implicitly assumed to be infinite. Nature's capacity to support life and renew itself constitutes another necessary background condition for commodity production and capital accumulation. Structurally, there's a story here too to be told. Capitalism assumes, indeed inaugurates, a rather sharp division between a natural realm conceived as offering a free, unproduced supply of raw material that is available for appropriation on the one hand, and an economic realm conceived as a sphere of value produced by and for human beings on the other hand. Along with this goes the hardening of the pre-existing distinction between the human, seen as spiritual, sociocultural, and historical, and non-human nature, seen as material, objectively given, and ahistorical. The sharpening of this distinction, too, rests on the breakup of a previous world, in which the rhythms of social life were in many respects adapted to those of non-human nature. Capitalism brutally separated human beings from seasonal rhythms, conscripting them into industrial manufacturing powered by fossil fuel and into profit-driven agriculture bulked up by chemical fertilizers. Introducing what Marx called a metabolic rift, it inaugurated what has now been called the Anthropocene, an entirely new geological era in which human activity has a decisive impact on the Earth's ecosystems and atmosphere. Arising with capitalism, this division too has mutated in the course of capitalist development. The current neoliberal phase has inaugurated a new round of enclosures. I'm thinking, for example, of the commodification of water and the patenting of DNA, while also proliferating new technologies that promise to blur the nature-human boundary. New reproductive technologies, genetically modified organisms, the cyborgs that Donna Haraway has written about. Far from offering a reconciliation with nature, however, these developments penetrate deep inside it, if one can speak that way, altering its internal grammar, affecting what Marx might have called the real subsumption of nature, just as an earlier phase of capitalism affected the real subsumption of labor. Finally, financialized capitalism is marketizing environmentalism. Witness the brisk trade in carbon permits and offsets and in environmental derivatives, which of course draw capital away from the long-term, large-scale investment needed to transform unsustainable forms of life premised on fossil fuels. Against the background of global warming, this assault on what remains of the ecological commons is turning the natural conditions of capital accumulation into another central node of capitalist crisis. Finally, I want to consider one last epistemic shift, which points to capitalism's political conditions of possibility, its reliance on public powers to establish and enforce its constitutive norms. Capitalism is inconceivable, after all, in the absence of a legal framework underpinning private property and market exchange. Its front story depends crucially on public powers to guarantee property rights, enforce contracts, adjudicate disputes, quell anti-capitalist rebellions, and maintain, in the language of our US Constitution, the full faith and credit of the money supply that constitutes capital's lifeblood. Historically, the public powers in question have mostly been lodged in territorial states, including those that operated as colonial powers. It was the legal systems of such states that established the contours of seemingly depoliticized arenas within which private actors could pursue their economic interests free from overt political interference on the one hand and from patronage obligations derived from kinship on the other hand. Likewise, it was territorial states that mobilized what we call legitimate force to put down resistance to the expropriations through which capitalist property relations were originated and sustained. And finally, it was such states that nationalized and underwrote money. Now here, we encounter another major structural division that is constitutive of capitalist society, the division between polity and economy. With this division comes the institutional differentiation of public from private power, of political from economic coercion. Like the other core divisions I've been discussing, this one too arises as a result of the breakup of a previous world. In this case, what was dismantled was a social world in which economic and political power were effectively fused, as for example in feudal society, where control over labor, land, and military force was vested in the single institution of lordship and vassalage. In capitalist society, by contrast, as Ellen Wood has elegantly shown, economic power and political power are split apart. Each is assigned its own sphere, its own medium and modus operandi. But that is not all. capitalism's front story also has political conditions of possibility at the geopolitical level. What is at issue here is the organization of the broader space in which territorial states are embedded. This is a space in which capital moves quite easily and naturally, given its expansionist thrust. But its ability to operate across borders depends on international law, brokered agreements among the great powers, and supranational regimes, which partially pacify, in a capital-friendly way to be sure, a realm that is often imagined as a state of nature. Throughout its history, capitalism's front story has depended on the military and organizational capacities of a succession of global hegemons, which, as Giovanni Arrighi has argued, sought to foster accumulation on a progressively expanding scale within the framework of a multi-state system. So here we find some further structural divisions that are constitutive of capitalist society. The so-called Westphalian division between the domestic and the international, on the one hand, and the imperialist division between the core and periphery, on the other hand, both premised on what is arguably the more fundamental division between an increasingly global capitalist economy organized as a world system and a political world organized as an international system of territorial states. These divisions are currently mutating as well, as neoliberalism is hollowing out the political capacities on which capital has historically relied at both the state and geopolitical levels. I'm thinking not only of the crisis of the territorial state and of that of the European Union, but also of the unraveling of US hegemony in the present moment. As a result of this hollowing out, capitalism's political conditions of possibility are also now a major site and flashpoint of capitalist crisis. Now, much more could and should be said on each of these points, but I hope that the general thrust of my argument is relatively clear. In filling out my initial account of capitalism, I've been showing that its economic foreground features depend on some non-economic background conditions. An economic system defined by private property, the accumulation of self-expanding value, markets in free labor and in other major inputs to commodity production, and by private appropriation and market allocation of social surplus, is rendered possible by three crucial background conditions concerned respectively with social reproduction, the Earth's ecology, and public power. To understand capitalism, therefore, we need to relate its front story to these three backstories. We have to connect the Marxian perspective to feminist, ecological, and political theoretical perspectives. I don't mean political theological. Political theoretical perspectives, by which I include state theoretical, colonial, post-colonial, and transnational. Now, the next step of the argument, what sort of animal is capitalism on this account? Well, the picture I've elaborated here differs importantly from the familiar idea that capitalism is merely an economic system. Granted, it might have looked at first sight as if the core features I identified and Marx identified were economic. But that appearance was misleading as it quickly became necessary to talk about the non-economic background conditions that enabled such an economic system to exist. So whatever it is, capitalism is something larger than an economy. Likewise, the picture I've sketched differs from the view that the Frankfurt School view that capitalism is a reified form of ethical life characterized by pervasive commodification and monetization. In my view, commodification is far from universal in capitalist society. On the contrary, it depends for its very existence, where it does exist, on zones of non-commodification. Social, ecological, and political, these non-commodified zones do not simply mirror the commodity logic, but embody distinctive normative and ontological grammars of their own. For example, social practices oriented to reproduction as opposed to production tend to engender ideals of care, mutual responsibility, and solidarity, however hierarchical and parochial these may often be. Likewise, practices oriented to polity as opposed to economy often refer to principles of democracy, public autonomy, popular sovereignty, collective self-determination, however restricted or exclusionary these typically are. Finally, practices associated with capitalism's background conditions in non-human nature tend to foster ethical orientations such as ecological stewardship and non-domination of nature, as well as moral ideals such as justice between generations, even if these are often romantic and sectarian. So I think you can see from these sort of critical parenthetic comments that my point here is not to idealize these non-economic normativities, but rather to register their divergence from the values associated with capitalism's foreground, which I take to be growth, efficiency, equal exchange, individual choice, negative liberty, and meritocratic advancement. Now, this divergence makes all the difference to how we conceptualize capitalism. Far from generating a single all-pervasive logic of reification, capitalist society is normatively differentiated, encompassing a determinate plurality of distinct but interrelated social ontologies. What happens when these collide remains to be seen, but the structure that underpins them is already clear, at least to me. Capitalism's distinctive normative topography arises from the foreground-background relations I've been discussing. If we aim to develop a critical theory of it, we must replace the view of capitalism as a reified form of ethical life with a more differentiated structural and institutional view. So, if capitalism is neither an economic system nor a reified form of ethical life, what is it? My answer is that it is best conceived as an institutionalized social order on a par, for example, with feudalism. Understanding capitalism in this way underscores its structural divisions, especially the institutional separations that I've been identifying. Constitutive of capitalism, I contend, is the institutional separation of economic production from social reproduction, that is a gendered separation that grounds specifically capitalist forms of male domination, even as it also enables capitalist exploitation of labor power, and through that, its officially sanctioned mode of accumulation. Also definitive of capitalism is the institutional separation of economy from polity, a separation that expels matters defined as economic from the political agenda of territorial states, while freeing capital to roam in a transnational no man's land where it reaps the benefits of hegemonic ordering while escaping political control. Equally fundamental to capitalism, finally, is the ontological division, pre-existing but massively intensified, between its non-human natural background and its apparently non-natural human foreground. Therefore, to speak of capitalism as an institutionalized social order premised on such separations is to suggest its non-accidental structural imbrication with gender oppression, political domination, both national and transnational, colonial and post-colonial, and ecological depredation, in conjunction, of course, with its equally structural, non-accidental foreground dynamic of labor exploitation. I do not mean to suggest, however, I think I already indicated this, that capitalism's institutional divisions are simply given once and for all. On the contrary, precisely where and how capitalist societies draw the line between production and reproduction, economy and polity, human and non-human nature, varies historically according to the regime of accumulation. In fact, we can conceptualize competitive laissez-faire capitalism, state-managed monopoly capitalism, and our own globalizing financialized capitalism in precisely these terms as three historically specific different ways of demarcating economy from polity, production from reproduction, and human from non-human nature. Equally important, the precise configuration of the capitalist order at any place and time depends on politics, on the balance of social power, and on the outcome of social struggles. Far from being simply given, capitalism's institutional divisions often become foci of social conflict as actors mobilize to challenge or defend the established boundaries separating economy from polity, production from reproduction, human from non-human nature. Insofar as they aim to relocate contested processes on capitalism's institutional map, capitalism's subjects draw on the normative perspectives associated with the various zones that I have identified. We can see this happening all around us today. For example, some opponents of neoliberalism are drawing on ideals of care, solidarity, and mutual responsibility associated with reproduction in order to oppose efforts to commodify education and healthcare, among other things. Others summon notions of stewardship of nature and justice between generations associated with the ecological background to militate for a shift to renewable energy. Still others invoke ideals of public autonomy associated with polity to advocate international capital controls and to extend democratic accountability beyond the state. Such claims, of course, inevitably incite counterclaims. And it's this play of claim and counterclaim that I believe constitutes the very stuff of social struggle in capitalist societies, as fundamental as the class struggles over control of commodity production and distribution of surplus value that Marx privileged. These boundary struggles, as I call them, decisively shape the structure of capitalist societies, and they play a constitutive role in the view of capitalism I'm elaborating here as an institutionalized social order. Now, the focus on boundary struggles suggests a rather complex view of the relations between foreground and background in capitalist society. On the one hand, reproduction, ecology, and political power can be viewed, as I viewed them, as necessary background conditions for capitalism's economic front story, a view that stresses their functionality for commodity production, labor exploitation, and capital accumulation. Nevertheless, these non-economic orders are not reducible to that enabling function. Far from being wholly exhausted by or entirely subservient to the dynamics of accumulation, each of these hidden abodes harbors distinctive ontologies of social practice and normative ideals, which are themselves pregnant with critical political possibility, especially in times of crisis, when they can be turned against core economic practices associated with capital accumulation. In normal times, capitalism's structural divisions serve to segregate the various normativities within their own institutional spheres. In times of crisis, by contrast, the divisions weaken. When the separations fail to hold, capitalism subjects, who live, after all, in more than one sphere, experience normative conflict. Far from bringing in ideas from the outside, they draw on capitalism's own complex normativity to criticize it, mobilizing against the grain, the multiplicity of ideals that coexist at times uneasily in an institutionalized social order premised on foreground-background divisions. So the view of capitalism as an institutionalized social order helps us understand how a critique of capitalism is possible from within it. Yet, This view also suggests that it would be wrong to construe society, polity, and nature romantically as simply outside capitalism and as inherently opposed to it. That romantic view is held today by a fair number of anti-capitalist thinkers and left-wing activists, including cultural feminists, deep ecologists, and neo-anarchists, as well as by many proponents of so-called plural, post-growth, solidary, and popular economies. Too often, these currents treat care, nature, direct action, or commoning as intrinsically anti-capitalist, overlooking the fact that their favorite practices are not only sources of critique, but in a sense, integral parts of the capitalist order. In my view, by contrast, society, polity, and nature arose concurrently with economy and developed in symbiosis with it. They are effectively the economy's others and only acquire their specific character by contrast to it. So reproduction and production make a pair, with each term co-defined by way of the other. Neither makes any sense, really, apart from the other. And the same is true of polity, economy, nature, human. Part and parcel of the capitalist order, none of these non-economic realms affords a wholly external standpoint that could underwrite an absolutely pure and fully radical form of critique. It follows that a proper account of capitalism's foreground-background relations has to hold together three distinct ideas. First, capitalism's non-economic realms serve as enabling background conditions for its economy. The latter depends, as I've argued, for its very existence on values and inputs from the former. Second, however, capitalism's non-economic realms have a weight and character of their own, which can, under certain circumstances, provide resources for anti-capitalist struggle. Nevertheless, and this is the third point, these realms are part and parcel of capitalist society, historically co-constituted in tandem with its economy and marked by their symbiosis with it. Now, there's also a fourth idea, which returns us to the problem of crisis with which I began. Capitalism's foreground-background relations harbor some built-in sources of social instability. As we saw, capitalist production is not self-sustaining, but free rides on social reproduction, nature, and public power. Yet, its orientation to endless accumulations threatens to destabilize these very conditions of its possibility. In the case of its ecological conditions, what are at risk are the natural processes that sustain life and provide the material inputs for social provisioning. In the case of its social reproduction conditions, what is imperiled are the sociocultural processes that supply the solidary relations, affective dispositions, and horizons of value that underpin social cooperation, while also furnishing the appropriately socialized and skilled human beings who constitute labor. In the case of its political conditions, what is compromised are the public powers, both national and transnational, that guarantee property rights, enforce contracts, adjudicate disputes, quell anti-capitalist rebellions, and maintain the money supply. Here in Marx's language are three contradictions of capitalism: the ecological, the social, and the political, which correspond to three crisis tendencies. Unlike the crisis tendencies stressed by Marx, however, these do not stem from contradictions internal to the capitalist economy. They are grounded, rather, in contradictions between the economic system and its background conditions of possibility. That is, between economy and society, economy and nature, economy and polity. Their effect, as I noted before, is to incite a broad range of social struggles in capitalist society, not only class struggles at the point of production, but also boundary struggles over ecology, social reproduction, and political power. responses to the crisis tendencies inherent in capitalist societies, those struggles are endemic to this expanded view of capitalism as an institutionalized social order. Okay, to my last point or two. What sort of critique of capitalism follows from the conception I've been sketching here? The view of capitalism as an institutionalized social order calls for a multi-stranded form of critical reflection, much like that developed by Marx in Das Kapital. As I read him, Marx interwove a system critique of capitalism's inherent tendency to crisis, which he understood as economic crisis, with a normative critique of its built-in dynamics of domination, which he understood as class domination, with a political or action theoretical critique of the potential for emancipatory social transformation inherent in its characteristic forms of struggle, which he understood, to be sure, as class struggle. Now, the view I have outlined here entails an analogous interweaving of critical strands, but the weave here is more complex, as each of the three strands is internally multiple. The system crisis critique includes not only the economic contradictions discussed by Marx, but also the three inter-realm contradictions discussed here, which destabilize the necessary background conditions for capital accumulation by jeopardizing social reproduction, ecology, and political power. Likewise, the domination critique encompasses not only the relations of class domination analyzed by Marx, but also those of gender domination, political domination, and the domination of nature. Finally, the political critique encompasses multiple sets of actors, classes, genders, status groups, nations, demoi, and multiple vectors of struggle, not only class struggles, but also boundary struggles over the separations of society, polity, and nature from economy. What can potentially count as an anti-capitalist struggle is thus much broader than Marxists have traditionally supposed. As soon as we look behind the front story to the back story, then all the indispensable background conditions for the exploitation of labor appear as potential foci of conflict in capitalist societies. Not just struggles between labor and capital, but also boundary struggles over gender domination, ecology, imperialism, and democracy. Equally important, the latter themselves, these struggles, now appear in another light, as struggles in, around, and in some cases, against capitalism itself. Finally, here's my last point, their emancipatory potential would consist in their capacity to envision new configurations of economy, society, nature, and polity, reimagining the structural divisions that have historically constituted capitalist societies represents the major tasks of social movements and critical theorists who are committed to emancipation in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions and comments, objections, whatever.
Given the complexity of the backstories and how you've enlarged on Marx's critique, and given the time frame of what's happening to us, do you have any hope that, I mean, where does, in order to understand this correctly, you might have to understand it the way you do, but that's very rare. So the social movements are happening with folks, kind of. So how do you do that?
I guess that I think that that in any period of capitalism or capitalist crisis, there will quite almost spontaneously emerge protests, social movements, struggles. In our case, very intense struggles over things like water, housing, the basic provisions for community and family life in the area of social reproduction. And ecology, and all the struggles over the European Union, for example, or other scales of political power. So these things are already happening. And even labor struggles, if you look especially to China, are happening in a very intense and rampant way. I think the problem is that they don't coalesce or converge in anything that we could recognize as a counter-hegemonic bloc, some kind of large project that says, no, we need some major deep structural changes. And it's very hard to imagine what it would take for that to happen. I don't have any illusion that simply providing an analysis is, going to call that into being. But I do think that to the degree that there are currents in each of these social movements that develop analyses that can locate particular struggles, particular issues, particular flashpoints in something like the broader map I've elaborated, or some other broad map, that at least offers a way of practical orientation in which people can see themselves on a certain map and understand what kind of relation they could have or should have with others located elsewhere on that map. That's at least something. And my feeling is that whenever there have been large-scale, successful social transformations, it's because you have had some kind of convergence in a counter-hegemonic bloc of a variety of forces with some, more or less, at least leading currents of which have some more or less enlarged understanding of things. Having said that, I guess I would also say that I want to make it clear that I'm not, I don't necessarily, I use the phrase counter-hegemonic bloc because I don't think any of us want to see the sort of hegemonization of every struggle behind one struggle in one party with, I think we're talking about something more differentiated. And so, but not dispersed and fragmented. There's some middle ground between Leninism and the multitude that I'm looking for, and I'm trying to sketch out a way of thinking at a broad scale that might prove useful for people who want to develop such a formation. Don.
Always a brilliant laying out of a whole field that enables rethinking. I'm trying to figure out the relationship between refunctioning these background stories and transforming the refunctioning, which is implicit in your description of each of these background stories as co-constitutive
Right.
of capitalism. And the transformation of the function, or refunctioning, into a critique
Right.
that would have critical force as opposed to inciting at a flashpoint an alternative way of refunctioning. As you describe the relations among these three background stories and the economy, capitalism. Capitalism would seem to include, insofar as it is co-constituted by each one of these background stories, as the foreground story, a complex interarticulation of all of what you've described as differential grammars of ontology, different normative structures.
Right.
If capitalism is the beneficiary of each of these background stories, if it includes, because of its prior refunctioning of these norms, either in a residual form or in a dominant, then the background stories have also become part of the foreground functioning of capitalism. There's a dimension of your narrative that I found. You're always moving back and forth between saying, I'm not romanticizing this.
Right.
I mean, and that has to be the gesture that you're making,
That's
because
important.
again and again, there's a way in which those, each one of those background stories wants to claim a kind of integrity as the source of a transformation of a flashpoint into a mode of critical struggle that can have a kind of uptake. But if capitalism is the beneficiary of all three of the background stories, and is therefore, as a complexified system, a tacit way of responding to each one of these backgrounds as the foreground for all three, wouldn't this redescription have as one of its unintended consequences a redescription of the way in which capital can constantly turn these crises boundary stories into a way of rendering itself all the more complex. There's one dimension of your narrative that I want to return to. You said, like feudalism,
Yes.
capitalism which presupposes in your narrative that if capitalism is indeed an analog to feudalism, then that narrative is suggesting that capitalism, like feudalism, can be historically replaced.
Absolutely.
But your analysis seems to have a dimension to it in which it can't be. Because each one of these background stories seems to be, at one level, resisting, but on another level, refurbishing.
I get the question. It's a deep and important question. And I want to just start by sort of clarifying terminology here, because we have to be careful. So I am reserving the term capitalism for the overarching institutionalized social order. I don't equate it with the foreground economy. So so I would say, this allows me to say something like this: the background norms and ontologies and realms are external to the capitalist economy, but internal to the capitalist social order. Okay, that's important. Okay. That already gives us, I think, some suppleness to start to think a little bit more about the question that you're raising. The idea is that the social order is constituted out of these specific institutional divisions, and it is entirely possible, and maybe even likely, that struggles that bring to bear ecological norms or social reproduction norms or democratic norms will be refunctioned. This is possible. One outcome of these struggles is some sort of, I don't know if this is really very likely, actually, but one outcome would be just some continuing more of the same with a little tinkering here and there. We're going to, draw the line here instead of there, that kind of thing. Another outcome is the transformation, the transition from the current globalizing neoliberal financialized capitalism to a new regime of accumulation, which would still be capitalism. That's a second possibility, just as we went from, state managed monopoly Fordism to this one. A third possibility is a transformation that actually does go, like you say, feudalism went to capitalism, to some successor institutionalized order. And here you have to add, it could be very ugly, or it could be, I mean, you know. Okay, so I think all of these things are possible. This, and then the hard question becomes what would count as post-capitalism? And I think the easiest case of the three to begin to start envisioning something has to do with the political, with the public power, because it might be possible to have Keynesianism on a global scale. This would still be capitalism, but you know, we'd have some forms of regulation and so on. It might also be possible, and that would be, I think, a rather new regime, yeah? That would not be neoliberalism anymore. It might not be stable for very long. It might turn out that some of the same accumulation dynamics would destabilize it. But it's also possible to imagine a real offensive, not just defending the political against the economic, and as in, pushing back against Citizens United or something, but you could also imagine an offensive drive in which those norms like popular sovereignty and public autonomy or whatever would actually begin to structure economic process itself. And I would say, at least for me, the crucial area would be, I think it was the third or fourth thing that I mentioned, the surplus. If we actually had political democratic determination of surplus allocation, even if we still had other forms of private ownership and we still had labor markets, and something big would have happened, something very big. I think I would call it post-capitalism, although I can't be sure. It sort of would depend on what else. So the point is that, or if you had think about social reproduction. If you had a social order in which social reproduction didn't happen residually as a byproduct of the foreground capital accumulation dynamic, but was treated, again, politically, as an overriding concern and aim. This would also be a very big change. Here we would be changing something about the relations between these things. And my idea is that the norms that are to hand, but often used in a very narrow way and so on, are available for making these kinds of arguments and making these kinds of claims. So I would say the empirical prospects might be slim, but the conceptual possibility is there. Yes?
I want to ask you a couple of questions. First, I just wanted to clarify for myself what your argument is. The attractiveness of Marx's argument is that there's really only one contradiction.
I'm sorry, can you speak louder?
The attractiveness of the Marx argument is that there's only one contradiction, which is the contradiction between the development of the forces of production and the relations of production, right? So then that is coupled with the kind of base superstructure argument. Now, what you've done when you, in response to Dawn, said you separated, you distinguished between capitalism as an institutionalized social order and the capitalist economy, and you've organized this around three different background, foreground, and struggles, is that you said all these things are, in fact, not superstructural, but infrastructural, right? And in that sense, then you've pluralized in a kind of Hegelian way, right? You said there are pluralization of spheres, and therefore plurality of values. But you've managed then to still inject a degree of normativity by saying that these...
Relativity?
Normativity.
Sorry.
Right, by injecting values from these different spheres. So the question is this. First of all, are there only 3 background stories? I mean, because you link them to what Wallerstein called anti-systemic movements. But when you look at Wallerstein, anti-systemic movements are just a laundry list of any kind of social movement. But you've quite neatly said that there are 3 movements, right? And are these 3 movements universal? These 3 stories, are they universal stories? Or are they historically conditioned stories? So that you could then imagine in a different epoch there would be more than these 3 background stories.
Yeah.
The second
Got it.
question.
Oh, okay.
Second broad question is about your point that your point of difference from the Frankfurt School is that you don't see capitalism as working in terms of a reification of Sittlichkeit. At the same time, in the dialectic of enlightenment, and then certainly in Adorno's own work, there is a critique of the domination of nature, and there is a kind of a preference from the mimetic basis, because it's a non-conceptual relation to nature. A little bit later on, when we spoke about the stewardship of nature, this relationship of care, and so on. Where would you place that kind of argument in relationship to the Adorno argument?
Okay, thanks. Those are both interesting questions. So on the first one, I would have to say that, are there only 3 backgrounds, or are there more? I suppose nothing rules out that there could be more. I just can't think of any, and if you can, let me know. I'm open to hearing it. It's not that the number 3 is sacrosanct, for sure, but these do seem to me the big ones, and who knows? And
so on what basis are you coming up with the 3?
I mean, I come up with social reproduction from feminism. I come up with polity economy from a whole literature. I mean, from forms of critique, and I mean look, it's a sort of fallibilistic thing. It either clarifies or it doesn't. I think it does, and maybe something else would an addition would, but I really can't think of anything. And I believe that these 3 background-foreground relations are a part of the entire history of capitalism. I think we can tell the history of capitalism as the story of their construction and unfolding and mutation. And if and when they cease to exist, that will be the end of the history of capitalism, I think. That doesn't mean that they function in exactly the same way at every period. I want to historicize them, excuse me. But I don't think you have these divisions prior to capitalism. I really don't. Now, in terms of yes, in general, there is the very interesting dialectic of enlightenment critique and mention, at least in other writings of Adorno, of the problem of the domination of nature. So it's a precedent, you could say, in critical theory. But I am certainly not, I'm certainly not following that sort of locates a dialectic of enlightenment that leads to the totally administered, fully reified society in which nothing but some obscure negative dialectical mimetic gesture is possible. I think a lot more, I can do a lot more than that. I've tried to do some of it here. It also locates it so far in the past and so deep in anthropology that it doesn't seem that it affords any possibility for what a critical theory should actually do. So I'm learning. The ecological is a relatively new area of research interest for me. I'm absolutely having a ball reading all the greatest material. There's such wonderful new stuff coming out on fossil capitalism and new land grabbing and all this kind of stuff. So there's a very rich development of literature that is trying to use a kind of historical materialism, and I'm following that as opposed to the Adorno line.
So you seem to be kind of telling a story in which, when you talk about, for example, the privatization of like the sphere of social reproduction or of speculation, carbon credits and such, the story you seem to be telling is one in which capitalism is now kind of consciously incorporating those spheres upon which it had formerly only unconsciously depended. So do you see this kind of as a sort of greater subsumption or reification of capitalism now, like a strengthening of it, or do you see it more as kind of capitalism undermining itself by kind of hollowing out those sources upon which it had been dependent?
That's a very good question, and I think my answer is the second, which is, again, not necessarily to be optimistic about what will happen. But I would say that, yes, that there is a push, a new push, definitive of this financialized neoliberal capitalism to, I would say, economize, bring into the foreground economy, this is an odd way to talk, more and more of what was in the background, but it's actually not a quantitative because at the same time all kinds of things are being expelled from the foreground too. So it's not really quantitative. I think there's this economizing, redrawing, again, the boundary between economy and these other things. To the profit, it looks like, of economy, that the boundaries are pushed back so that what counts as the economy is bigger, in a sense. That might look, at first sight, like a strengthening of and it's certainly happening because the class forces that want to do that are very powerful. They are being strengthened, that's for sure. But I think it's, in the end, actually deeply destabilizing, including for capitalism itself. And I guess the financial realm is the most obvious. I mean, isn't it sort of clear to everybody that without some kind of global financial regulation, we're just going to have a repeat of 2007-8 on a much bigger scale? I think capitalists must know this, but they're not willing to do anything about it. And this is like lemming-like behavior, even from the standpoint of their own interests. And it's a really different situation from, say, the 1930s, where you had a fraction of so-called enlightened capitalist interests that coalesced behind Roosevelt, that understood that they needed to make some deep structural changes if they were going to preserve capitalism. And I don't know, I guess Marx would say maybe it's an indication of the decline of the class, that they're not able to think that way, and therefore this weakening of the whole thing. I don't know, but it is something that I've noted, that they're not going to save themselves this time, so it seems. Estelle.
Yeah, my question is about your current definition of the gender order.
Yes.
From what you say today, it seems that now the gender order coincides with the divide between production and social reproduction. So is it so? Because in that case, it would be a major shift in your work, I would say. Because before you thought about this gender order as something that would emerge from, let's say, triple logic, that would be the distributive logic, the cultural logic, and the political logic. So now it seems that it's a much more monolithic way of thinking about the gender order. So does it coincide with this divide? Is there something that goes beyond it? And another way to put the question would be, how do those three preconditions relate one with another, and in particular how the gender order relates to the public powers?
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting provocation. And I think what I want to say about it is that from a structural point of view, the production-reproduction division tracks very closely with gender, not because it absolutely must, but because in the history of capitalism, as it developed, that was a gender division, and we are still living with it as we vainly try to create women's equality by leaning in at the corporation without doing anything else. We're still, and you know, those efforts are running afoul over just this kind of division. So I think it is a major structural underpinning. But wrapped up with this idea, let me say first, I wouldn't want to say that those other divisions that I mentioned, the other three, are not connected to gender either. They clearly are, including the polity economy division is going to have very profound implications for social reproduction. The ecological question has very profound implications throughout much of the world, where people are kind of on the front lines of ecological disaster, and women play a very fundamental role in somehow managing to find a way to live and cope and fight back in some cases. So I guess what I need to do is make it clear that, I mean, part of the problem with this paper is that I presented these three things as separate. In fact, they interimbricate, and any account of anything like gender has got to show the full interimbrication. That would be one point. But the other point is that I'm also claiming that politics, in this other sense of struggle over boundaries, is absolutely fundamental to all of these divisions and how they get drawn and redrawn and undrawn and so on. So the political side of it, I think, is already in there. The cultural is the hardest one for me now to think about in this frame, and part of the reason is that I have somehow folded it in with social reproduction. So it's not emerging in a, but I actually want to do that because I don't, in this sense, I do not want to defend the narrow Marxist feminist view that social reproduction consists in the reproduction of labor power, period, nor that it's something that takes place only in private households. I have this larger view of it, and so it is the place where care work and subjectivation and recognition, and if I were to go back to that language, are happening. Yeah. Mm.
your points that you just made about political organization, possible political mobilizations. And this also relates to your point that the economy of capitalism is able to ride over top of these three interimbricated spheres of political action. So the question is, do politics in the three spheres, is it a different kind of politics than what would be necessary to change the overriding economy? And does that mean that ultimately what an emancipated society would necessitate politically would be first, like maybe politics of recognition and then politics of redistribution? That's the question.
Got it. Well, I think that you're right that there are different levels and sort of kinds of politics in the background here of what I said, another background. And the way I think of it would be in terms of a distinction that I developed in a previous book between ordinary politics and metapolitics. And I think that metapolitics, ordinary politics would be sort of what goes on either at the formal level or in the civil society level within that neatly given realm of the political as it is instantiated at any time. But metapolitics at the largest scale is the politics of struggling over the relations among these realms. And among other things, this may sound paradoxical, but I don't think it is. Among other things, it has to deal with the question, what should be handled in the realm of politics as opposed to in the realm of economy or something else. And that is a political question, but it's a metapolitical question, if you like. And so I think that, and I don't want to endorse the idea of some sort of stage theory, first recognition, then redistribution, or any other variant of that thing. I mean, I think that, first of all, I mean, these things are all somehow interimbricated, number one. And you know, people will make the claims that seem most urgent to them, or those that are feasible or even seem easy given the resources, including the discursive resources that they have to hand. I don't think that's a sort of a question for theory as to, you know, what they should do in what order. The theoretical question maybe is a little bit the post hoc question. How, given what they are doing, might they, you know, come to see each other as allies and, you know, as I said before, converge in some sort of a counter-hegemonic formation?
Sure, like I think
Yeah.
that, like I agree with all of that. I guess the question is though, if we like, you know, we come to agreements, come to counter-hegemonic blocks, if we're still under if there's still an economy and a capitalist order that can ride over top these different blocks, then like, and if that economy is premised on relations of injustice, like, how do we negotiate that?
Well, as I said in answer to a previous question, you could imagine more or less radical possibilities, right? I mean, one possibility, again, just think back to the sort of Keynesian welfare state, which is drawing the line between the public power and the market at a different place from where neoliberalism draws it, and is saying you can go this far, but no further. The second you override whatever it is, you know, state power comes down on you. Something like that I don't think is possible any longer today within a single country or even within a single region, but would depend on larger global political ways of taming. The social democrats always use that expression, use politics to tame markets. And I would say neoliberalism uses markets to tame politics. Okay, so, but there's a more radical possibility too. And that is that that there is some greater empowerment of the political that is not just this far and not so further, but we, in an offensive way, change things about the internal aspects of the economy. And I think that's what historically Marxism was looking to do. Unfortunately, what we got, and I wouldn't hold Marx himself responsible, but what we got was the sort of command economy and the, authoritarian party state. So that's not what we should mean something else by that. Whoops. But you could imagine things that go more than just the Keynesian solution.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Dietmar.
I appreciate very highly your lecture and your new model, but I'm curious in one direction. You distinguish three directions of saving values which are not commodifiable. And I read your distinction between the social, the ecological, and the political as three domains that should be kept out of commodification. The general question in your lecture, as I understand it, is what is not commodifiable. And if we say that the social, the nature, the political community, and the individualized life are not commodifiable at some extent, and we should fight for this. This is of course very good constraint against the expansion of the markets. But what left unclear for me is how could we distinguish a left politics in these three directions from a classical conservative one.
From what?
Classical conservative one, because these are three domains. They could be written as three domains of sacred values.
Right. That's a great question, and I am not arguing that there are some domains that are either not commodifiable, or that there is something that is not commodifiable, nor am I arguing, at least not here, that there is something that should not be commodified. And this is something this is sort of a set of views that I've developed on these questions in my engagement with Polanyi. And I read Polanyi as falling into that exact trap that you just articulated, arguing at the same time and not really fully distinguishing. There are some things that are not commodifiable. B, they shouldn't be commodified. And C, we need to defend them against commodification. And D, he doesn't say this explicitly, we end up somehow in a reactionary, defensive, communitarian posture. And I reject every step in that argument. I would say, on terms of what is not commodifiable, there's no single thing you can name that is not commodifiable. But you cannot commodify everything. Something has to be in the background. It's that kind of argument. For example, we know from the whole very rich feminist literature on global care chains that when you start to commodify care work among the professional managerial class in the countries of the core, or even in the semi-periphery and the core, you don't commodify all of care work, you displace it down a chain to ever less, right, advantaged people. And there's no way to fully eliminate that. So, I mean, that would be an example of how you can't commodify everything. Having said that, I am not arguing for prohibition. I would not argue that that there should be no nursing homes or assisted living facilities for elder people in which people are not paid to work. I might think about whether they need to be paid much better than they are now, and it may be worth thinking about whether these should be run for profit. Probably not. But this is not an argument for prohibition. It's really just, and here I haven't done it, but I need to get into a lot of questions, issues of policy, there's a rich philosophical literature about the moral dimensions of commodifying sex, of commodifying, all kinds of other things. And for me, I guess there are a couple of questions here. I mean, given what I've said in this project so far, I would say that there are sustainability questions. Will this be inherently destabilizing in some way that would be disastrous if we did this? Also very fundamental, is commodification of X inherently linked to domination? This is a part of domination critique as well as a system sustainability critique. It might be that I wouldn't object to sex work if it were really disconnected from issues of domination, although it's, it might be very, very difficult to do that. And then there are ethical considerations, which have to do with, is the meaning of this thing so sacred that, you don't want to do that because you change the meaning and you soil something. Those are my least favorite kinds of arguments. And I'm not saying that there might never be a case where you have to confront them, but my tendency is to always try to hold them off and deal with questions using either of the other two kinds of arguments, the domination or the sustainability argument. So, but I am not for prohibition on selling land, agricultural products, all kinds of things. The question is, what kinds of markets, how are they regulated, what is their systemic impact, what are the surrounding credit relations, and I think one big thing is has to do with the proposal, which I like very much, to treat finance as a public utility, not as a for-profit business. That credit is a necessary aspect of a complex modern society. But we could have socialist banks and so on that deal with it. Anyway, so this is a complicated question, but all I can say for sure now is that this Polanyian argument that you laid out is exactly the one that I am rejecting. Okay.
I think we thank Nancy for her time.
Thank you.